Ethan Carter had never imagined that the quiet cul-de-sac he'd chosen as his sanctuary would soon become a battleground. A decorated military veteran turned dedicated city official, Ethan balanced his days between policy meetings at City Hall and evenings under the soft glow of his meticulously restored vintage car in his driveway. For him, his suburban home wasn't just brick and mortar. It was a tribute to hard work, honor, and the promise of a peaceful life after years of service. Every nail in his newly built porch, every stroke of paint on the time-worn picket fence, held memories of sacrifice and the optimism of a fresh start. The charm of his home extended beyond aesthetics. Nestled on a generous plot with a sprawling backyard and an old oak tree that whispered tales of yesteryear, Ethan's property had a spirit of its own. He spent weekends tinkering in his garage, reviving classic automobiles with the same precision that once guided his military decisions. It was a place of solace, a personal retreat from the endless demands of public service. But in the same neighborhood resided a force of entitlement that could sour the sweetest serenity. Enter Karen, the self-appointed matriarch of a local homeowners association, HOA. With her perfectly coiffed hair, an ever-present clipboard in hand, and a demeanor as frosty as the plastic frosted windows of the community clubhouse, Karen believed that order was paramount, and that any deviation from her rigid vision of suburban perfection was a personal affront. She ruled the HOA like a mini-dictator, enforcing rules that seemed less about community harmony and more about her own self-importance. It was on a brisk autumn morning when the first spark of conflict was ignited. Ethan, enjoying his customary coffee on the sun-dappled porch, was interrupted by a knock at the door. Standing there was Karen herself, with a tight-lipped smile that barely concealed her disdain. "Mr. Carter," she began in a clipped tone, "I've been informed that your porch lights are, quite frankly, excessively bright. They disrupt the ambience we maintain in this community." Ethan frowned. He'd chosen his lighting to ensure safety along the walkway, never imagining that his careful decisions would be subject to the whims of an overzealous board president. "I appreciate your concern, Karen," he replied evenly, "but I'm certain I'm well within local ordinance. My lights aren't a nuisance, they're a safety feature." Her smile widened into something resembling condescension. "Safety is one thing, Mr. Carter, but aesthetics are another," she countered. "The HOA guidelines are clear. We can't have one homeowner turning their property into a beacon for outsiders." Her tone left no room for debate. This was not a mere conversation about lights. It was an assertion of power. Karen's eyes flicked to the clipboard she held, as if each bullet point was a decree handed down from a higher authority. Though Ethan was no stranger to bureaucracy, he had never encountered such an uncompromising enforcer. The crisp morning air, once filled with the scent of freshly mown grass and promise, now carried the tension of an impending showdown. It wasn't long before he realized that this encounter was only the opening salvo in what would become a drawn-out conflict, a battle of wills between a man who cherished his independence and an HOA determined to mold every inch of the neighborhood to its own rigid standard. As Karen left with a curt nod, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't finished. Deep down, he knew that beneath her prim exterior lay a propensity for bending rules, and perhaps even breaking them, to suit her narrative of order. That day, as he returned to his workbench, the hum of his vintage engine in the garage became the soundtrack to his mounting determination. Ethan silently vowed that if the HOA were to enforce its so-called rules by bending them out of shape, he would stand firm for what was right. His home was his fortress, and no one, least of all an entitled board president, had the right to change that. Later that afternoon, while sifting through community newsletters and HOA bulletins, Ethan discovered a litany of absurd infractions levied against his neighbors. It was clear that Karen's idea of community standards was less about safety or aesthetics and more about wielding power. As the golden sunlight faded into dusk, Ethan's peaceful world began to look less like a haven and more like the stage for an impending turf war. And as he locked his front door that night, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of an all-out siege on his cherished sanctuary? The next morning, Ethan awoke to a sight that chilled his blood. A stark white envelope was taped to his door. Inside, An official-looking notice declared a $750 fine for violating community light regulations. The language was precise, clinical, and yet it reeked of the kind of arbitrary authority that had become all too common under Karen's reign. Outside, Karen was already on display, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and a self-satisfied glint in her eye. She greeted him with a barely concealed smirk. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Carter. There are no exceptions," she said in a tone that brooked no dissent. Ethan, ever the calm and measured city official, quickly scrutinized the notice. The document was riddled with legal jargon and cited obscure clauses from the HOA bylaws, clauses that didn't even reference state or local ordinances. "Karen," he said, voice firm but respectful, "I've reviewed these regulations. They don't give the HOA the authority to enforce such penalties. My lighting meets all municipal codes." Karen's smile never wavered. "I'm sure you believe that, but these are the rules you agreed to when you moved in," she replied coolly. Her eyes glittered with a mixture of entitlement and triumph, as if the very act of handing him a fine was a victory over any who dared question her authority. Determined not to be bullied, Ethan gathered his documents and promptly scheduled a meeting with the local zoning office. When he arrived, he found his claim greeted not with understanding, but with bureaucratic indifference, until he mentioned the HOA's latest transgression. The inspector's interest was piqued. Further inquiries revealed that Karen had a reputation for interpreting rules in ways that conveniently punished dissenters. Before long, Ethan began receiving unexpected visits from city inspectors. At first, it was merely a routine check of his property, but the frequency soon became alarming. Inspectors arrived at unannounced hours, scrutinizing every inch of his land for irregularities. Each time, Ethan patiently explained that his property was in full compliance, citing local ordinances and building codes. Yet behind the scenes, Karen's relentless pressure had ignited a flurry of anonymous complaints. As word of his defiance began to ripple through the neighborhood, a few skeptical board members exchanged uneasy glances. But Karen was a master of manipulation. During the next HOA meeting, she paraded the fine before the community, portraying Ethan as a delinquent who refused to abide by the standards of their idyllic suburb. "We must all conform," she proclaimed, her voice echoing off the sterile walls of the meeting hall. "If one homeowner undermines our collective values, the consequences affect us all." Ethan's rebuttal was measured and precise. "I'm simply adhering to the law as it stands," he said, holding his ground while maintaining a respectful tone. "The fine is unjust, and I plan to have it reviewed." His declaration was met with murmurs of approval from some residents and thinly veiled disapproval from those too afraid to oppose Karen openly. The situation escalated quickly. Karen's tactics shifted from passive-aggressive fines to overt legal threats. One afternoon, a stern-looking attorney representing the HOA appeared at Ethan's door. With a stack of legal documents in hand, the attorney warned him that further defiance could lead to more severe actions, perhaps even a civil suit. Karen's influence had reached far, and her actions were now backed by the threat of law enforcement intervention. Ethan's mind raced as he scanned the papers. Each clause was a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate, designed not to uphold genuine community safety, but to cement Karen's tyrannical control. "I will be filing a formal complaint with the zoning board and seeking legal counsel," Ethan declared, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "This isn't about lights, it's about your overreach." By the time dusk settled on that fateful day, Ethan's once peaceful life had become a war zone of legal documents, surprise inspections, and a community divided by fear and entitlement. The HOA's first power move had been executed with cold precision, and Karen's message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. But Ethan's resolve was only hardening. In the quiet of his home that night, as he reread the zoning codes and prepared his counter-arguments, he silently vowed that no fine or threat would force him to surrender his property or his principles. As the days turned into weeks, the tactics employed by Karen and her loyal board members grew more audacious, and in many respects, blatantly illegal. What began as a single fine had morphed into an all-out campaign against Ethan's peaceful sanctuary. The next salvo came in the form of an insidious series of false violations, notices for unauthorized landscaping, obstructed sightlines, and even improper waste disposal. Each charge was as absurd as it was unsubstantiated, yet each was backed by the cold, bureaucratic language of the HOA rulebook. Ethan, though perturbed by the onslaught, began to notice a troubling pattern. A couple of his neighbors, initially silent on the matter, started whispering about similar grievances. Late-night phone calls, furtive glances in the hallway, and hushed conversations over back fences all pointed to one disturbing truth. Karen was using the HOA's authority as a weapon, targeting any homeowner who dared to question her. Rumors of hush money donations to the HOA fund and missing fines began to circulate, casting a long shadow over the board's legitimacy. Driven by an unyielding sense of justice, Ethan started to dig deeper into the workings of the HOA. Over the course of several evenings, he pored over public records and attended meetings incognito. It didn't take long for him to uncover evidence of systemic corruption. One board member, hesitant at first, eventually confided in him that Karen had been siphoning off HOA funds for her personal expenses. "They never ask where the money goes," the board member whispered, glancing around nervously. "It's always for community improvements, until you see Karen's new wardrobe and her lavish dinners." The revelation hit Ethan like a freight train. This wasn't a case of overzealous enforcement, it was outright extortion. Determined to document every irregularity, he set up discreet cameras around his property. Night after night, he captured snippets of suspicious activity. Midnight meetings in the shadows of the community clubhouse, hushed conversations with local inspectors, and even a board member accepting an envelope of cash in exchange for silence. Armed with his growing collection of evidence, Ethan began formulating a counterattack. His strategy was twofold: expose the corruption at its core while simultaneously defending his own rights as a homeowner. He reached out to a few trusted neighbors, sharing his findings and urging them to review their own experiences with the HOA. The more he learned, the clearer it became that Karen's actions were less about protecting property values and more about consolidating power. At the next HOA meeting, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Karen, as if sensing the shift in sentiment, took to the podium with her usual air of self-importance. "Let me remind you all," she began, her voice firm, "that our community standards are non-negotiable. Anyone who does not comply with our rules is undermining the very fabric of our neighborhood." Ethan, standing near the back of the room with a stack of printed documents under his arm, felt his pulse quicken. When the meeting adjourned for a brief recess, he approached a few homeowners and quietly handed them copies of the evidence he'd gathered. Murmurs of disbelief and outrage quickly spread. For the first time, several long-suffering residents began to question the legitimacy of the fines and the true motives behind Karen's strict enforcement. But Karen wasn't about to let her empire of entitlement crumble without a fight. During the post-meeting break, she cornered Ethan in a narrow corridor lined with outdated community photos. "I suggest you watch your tone, Mr. Carter," she hissed, her eyes flashing with fury. "The HOA doesn't tolerate insubordination." Her words carried an unspoken threat, a promise that the next round of actions would be even more severe. Ethan's response was calm but resolute. "I'm not insubordinate, Karen. I'm simply holding you accountable for abusing your power." His words, delivered in a low, measured tone, seemed to echo off the drab wallpaper of the corridor, a declaration of defiance against an institution gone rogue. With tensions rising on both sides, the stage was set for an all-out battle that would pit one determined homeowner against an HOA hell-bent on total control. Karen's next moves would be crucial, and Ethan knew that each act of overreach would only strengthen his resolve to expose the corruption and reclaim his home from the clutches of entitlement. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Ethan's worst fears materialized. As dawn broke over the neighborhood, he was jolted awake by the sound of heavy machinery. Rushing outside, he found his driveway under siege. Bulldozers and diggers had arrived without warning, and a line of tow trucks blocked the only exit. Karen's latest decree had arrived in the form of an emergency sidewalk expansion order, An order that meant not only the destruction of his cherished driveway, but also a blatant attempt to seize control over part of his land. Karen stood at the edge of the chaos, clipboard in hand and a steely glint in her eyes. "This is for the greater good," she announced to no one in particular. "Our community must evolve, even if it means making temporary sacrifices." But to Ethan, it was nothing more than a thinly veiled act of aggression. The destruction of his driveway was symbolic, a tangible assault on his property rights, and the freedom he'd fought so hard to secure. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed his legal documents and, with a deep breath to steady his racing heart, marched toward the temporary community office set up by the HOA. The impromptu meeting space was filled with tense board members and a scattering of homeowners who had gathered out of concern and curiosity. As Ethan entered, a hush fell over the room. Clutching his file of local ordinances and zoning codes, he cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating with both authority and passion, "I have here all the documentation proving that the HOA has no jurisdiction over these alterations to my property." The room erupted into murmurs. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, while Karen's face reddened with indignation. "You're overreacting, Mr. Carter," she snapped, trying to regain control of the proceedings. "This is about community improvement, not personal vendettas." Her words, however, rang hollow against the mounting evidence Ethan presented. The homeowners began to ask questions. Why had inspections never been conducted on other properties with similar characteristics? Why was Ethan the only one singled out for such draconian measures? Emboldened by the support, Ethan laid out a meticulously organized case. He detailed every overstep by the HOA, from the unwarranted fines to the illegal towing, and, now, the unauthorized construction on his land. Each point was reinforced with documented evidence, photographs, and even video clips captured by the hidden cameras he had strategically placed around his property. With every piece of evidence, the balance of power shifted further away from Karen. Karen's protests grew louder, yet increasingly desperate. "You're jeopardizing the entire community's reputation," she argued. "If we allow this kind of defiance, chaos will ensue." But the room's mood had irrevocably changed. Homeowners who had long endured minor inconveniences and unexplained fines began to see Ethan as a champion, a man standing up not just for himself, but for every resident suffocated by arbitrary rules. At that moment, the tide turned. One of the once loyal board members, whose eyes had betrayed uncertainty, rose and spoke up. "I've been reviewing the financial records," he admitted, voice wavering slightly, "and it appears that several of these fines and fees have been misappropriated. I can't support actions that are clearly driven by personal gain rather than community welfare." His confession was the spark that ignited a full-blown revolt. More board members murmured in agreement, and soon, Karen's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Fury and panic danced in Karen's eyes as she attempted one final appeal. "Hi, this isn't what the HOA stands for," she stuttered, but her words were drowned out by the growing chorus of discontent. Homeowners demanded transparency and accountability, and many pledged to vote out the current board at the next meeting. Amid the clamor, Ethan took one last stand. "I have nothing against a community that values fairness," he declared. "But I cannot stand by while my rights and our collective trust are trampled by abuse of power." As the meeting adjourned, a palpable sense of change filled the air. The tow trucks slowly backed off, the heavy machinery idled, and Ethan's driveway was left unscathed for the time being. In that small but significant victory, the seeds of rebellion had been firmly planted. Karen might have panicked in the moment, but she refused to acknowledge defeat. And yet, for the first time, the community was united against her relentless overreach, each resident determined to reclaim their voice and their rights. Determined to salvage her crumbling authority, Karen resolved to pull one final, desperate trick from her bag of underhanded tactics. In a calculated move that would prove to be her undoing, she began orchestrating a series of actions designed to intimidate and discredit Ethan once and for all. Her strategy was to involve the police and escalate the situation to a point where Ethan would be forced to back down, a move that, in her mind, would reassert the HOA's iron grip on the community. One quiet evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, Karen dialed the local police station with a fabricated emergency. Her voice, urgent and fraught with faux alarm, reported that Ethan's brightly lit porch was not only a violation of HOA standards, but was causing a public disturbance that threatened the safety and peace of the community. In her narration, she exaggerated every detail, claiming that the lights were so intense they were blinding passers-by, and even attracting unwanted attention from dubious strangers. Within minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the stillness of the night. Blue and red lights bathed Ethan's front yard as police cruisers pulled up. In a twist of irony, as the officers stepped out and approached the scene, Ethan calmly produced his city official badge. His authority and clear-cut evidence of compliance left little room for the police to maneuver. They exchanged curt words with Karen, whose desperate protestations quickly fell on deaf ears. "It's a public disturbance," she insisted, voice shaking as she clutched her clipboard. But the officers, now well aware of the recurring disputes between Ethan and the HOA, gave her complaint little credence. Not one to concede defeat so easily, Karen escalated her tactics even further. Late the next day, under cover of early morning darkness, she employed a private investigator, someone reputed for his shadowy methods, to dig up any shred of evidence that might tarnish Ethan's reputation. The PI was given free rein to snoop through Ethan's life, his personal schedule, his meetings at City Hall, even his quiet moments on the porch. However, in a twist of fate that would soon turn the tide, Ethan's ever-watchful security cameras captured everything. Hidden on one grainy but unmistakable video was the investigator creeping around Ethan's garage, his actions blatantly intrusive and clearly illegal. The following evening, during a tense HOA meeting that had become a battleground of its own, Ethan produced the incriminating footage. The room fell into an awed silence as the evidence of Karen's covert operation played out on the projector screen. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was not just a matter of a rogue investigator. It was clear proof that Karen had crossed the line into outright criminality. "This isn't just about your lights or fines," Ethan said, his voice echoing with quiet fury. "It's about abusing power and violating privacy. You've no right to spy on your neighbors." Karen's face, once a mask of unassailable authority, crumpled under the weight of evidence. Her eyes darted across the room, searching desperately for any sign of support. But the community, now emboldened by Ethan's courage and transparency, turned its back on her. One by one, residents began recounting their own encounters with inexplicable fines, intrusive inspections, and the ever-growing sense that the HOA's rules were designed to stifle dissent rather than protect property values. In a final futile bid to reassert control, Karen attempted to launch a counteroffensive by threatening a lawsuit, one that would target Ethan personally for defamation and disruption of community harmony. The threat, however, rang hollow in a room where the scales of justice had already begun to tip in favor of the people. Lawyers among the homeowners nodded knowingly, and whispers of a collective legal action began to circulate. By the end of the meeting, it was evident that Karen's desperate measures had backfired spectacularly. Not only had her attempt to involve the police and the private investigator failed, but it had also exposed the full extent of her overreach. The community now saw her not as the benevolent guardian of their neighborhood, but as a tyrant whose every move was driven by self-interest and a hunger for power. As the meeting concluded with a resounding declaration that change was imminent, Karen slunk away, her final, desperate moves having only sealed her fate. In the wake of Karen's disastrous last-ditch effort, the community began to mobilize in ways that left no doubt the HOA, as it had been known, was on the brink of collapse. A series of town hall meetings, neighborly gatherings, and impassioned discussions set in motion a chain reaction that would topple the regime of entitlement once and for all. The very next week, armed with Ethan's detailed documentation and the damning video footage of Karen's illicit actions, a coalition of homeowners united to file a formal complaint with the city. The local government, long aware of murmurs about the HOA's malpractices, launched an investigation into the board's operations. As a probe unfolded, It became clear that Karen's manipulation of funds, her misuse of legal threats, and her abusive enforcement tactics were not isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic pattern of corruption. In a dramatic twist, during an emergency board meeting convened by the city's housing authority, several longtime board members publicly renounced their support for Karen. One by one, they recounted incidents of intimidation, arbitrary fines, and the undue pressure that had been placed on them to ignore community concerns. The tide of public opinion had turned decisively. With mounting evidence and the city's backing, the board was forced to vote on Karen's immediate removal from office. In a nearly unanimous decision, Karen was ousted. Her once ironclad grip on the community reduced to nothing more than a bitter memory. The fallout was swift and merciless. The very structure of the HOA was reformed under new leadership committed to transparency, fairness, and the true welfare of the community. Fines were rescinded. All unauthorized alterations to properties were ordered to be reversed, and an independent audit was commissioned to assess the full extent of the previous board's misdeeds. For Ethan, the victory was deeply personal, a hard-fought affirmation that his home, his sanctuary, was not for sale to bureaucratic tyranny. As Karen's public downfall unfolded, the personal repercussions soon followed. In an instant that seemed almost poetic, news spread that Karen's house, the symbol of her authority, was forced onto the market. Overnight, the home that had once been the epicenter of her power was listed for sale, its pristine exterior now a stark reminder of ambition turned sour. And while Karen's fate was sealed in the eyes of the community, Ethan found solace in the small, everyday victories that punctuated his days. A quiet morning coffee on a porch that had withstood the onslaught of unwarranted fines. A friendly nod from a neighbor who now knew what it meant to stand up for one's rights. The scene that followed was almost surreal. At a celebratory neighborhood barbecue organized in the wake of the scandal, residents laughed over stories of past grievances. For the first time in months, the atmosphere was light and genuinely communal. Ethan, sitting in his favorite chair on his back porch, sipped his coffee with a wry smile. The battle had been long and arduous, but the victory was undeniably sweet, a resounding testament that no amount of entitlement or overreach could ever truly silence a community united by common sense and a shared belief in justice. Karen's fall from grace was complete. Her once proud persona was now relegated to whispered anecdotes, a cautionary tale of power abused and the inevitable reckoning that follows. And as the community moved forward, each resident carried with them a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to ensure that their neighborhood remained a place where fairness, respect, and the rule of law reigned supreme. With the winds of change sweeping through the neighborhood, the legal backlash against the now-defunct HOA began in earnest. The city's investigation, bolstered by Ethan's comprehensive evidence, resulted in steep fines levied against the HOA for its unauthorized actions. Local authorities initiated a series of lawsuits against former board members, and several were summoned to answer for financial improprieties and breaches of public trust. Ethan, now recognized as a community hero, helped his neighbors file a class action suit against the HOA. The lawsuit aimed not only to recoup the unjust fines that had been levied against individual homeowners, but also to establish strict oversight of any future community association practices. His final power move came during a press conference where he laid out the detailed timeline of abuses, a timeline that left little room for denial. The legal hammer was falling hard, and every piece of evidence had found its mark. In court, the once feared practices of Karen's regime were exposed in stark detail. Expert testimonies, financial audits, and recorded footage painted a picture of corruption that was as damning as it was undeniable. The presiding judge, visibly moved by the collective suffering of the community, announced a landmark ruling that would reshape HOA governance in the region for years to come. For Ethan, the legal victory was bittersweet, a necessary reckoning that, while not undoing the past, provided a promise for a fairer future. The courtroom drama, marked by impassioned arguments and a swift dispensation of justice, signaled the end of an era. The HOA was dissolved, its legacy forever tarnished by greed and abuse, and the community was finally free to rebuild on a foundation of transparency and respect. As the dust settled on the legal and administrative front, the personal consequences for Karen unfolded in a series of humiliating setbacks. No longer shielded by the veneer of authority, Karen was forced to confront the reality of her own downfall. Rumors swirled that her personal finances had been severely impacted by the fines, and soon, whispers of her impending eviction from the neighborhood became impossible to ignore. Within weeks, her signature car, a status symbol of her erstwhile power, was repossessed by creditors. The once imposing figure of Karen, who had commanded meetings with an iron fist, was now seen haggling over overdue bills and facing the scorn of a community she had once bullied. Matters worsened further when even her personal relationships began to unravel. Her estranged husband, long weary of her relentless obsession with control, filed for divorce, leaving her isolated and exposed. In a final symbolic twist of fate, Karen found herself employed as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a position that, to her bitter irony, demanded strict adherence to rules she had so vehemently flouted. When Ethan caught a glimpse of her in the uniform of her new employer at a city property inspection, a wry smile tugged at his lips. "I hope you like following the rules," he murmured under his breath, a silent mic drop that resonated with poetic justice. Her public persona had crumbled, and the community's memory of her was now a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that entitlement and abuse of power always come with a steep price. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood began to heal. The dark chapter of oppressive fines, baseless inspections, and personal vendettas was now behind them. Ethan's home, once the epicenter of conflict, transformed back into a sanctuary of peace and genuine community spirit. Neighbors, long intimidated into silence, now gathered freely on their porches and lawns to share stories, laughter, and plans for a more inclusive future. One crisp evening, as Ethan reclined in his favorite rocking chair on his now quiet porch, a familiar figure approached. It was a friendly neighbor with a mischievous grin, handing him a freshly printed HOA violation notice, this time for something utterly absurd. A minor infraction involving the excessive brightness of a garden gnome's LED. The absurdity of the paper, now a relic of a tyrannical past, prompted a wave of laughter among those gathered. Ethan's eyes sparkled with humor as he held the notice aloft, the community's shared victory palpable in the air. "They really tried," he said, his tone light yet laden with the gravity of hard-won justice. In that moment, it was clear that the neighborhood had been irrevocably transformed. No longer would petty rules or overbearing authorities dictate the rhythm of their lives. Instead, each resident carried a newfound sense of empowerment, a belief that when people stand together, even the most entrenched systems of entitlement can be dismantled. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over manicured lawns and freshly painted mailboxes, the laughter and banter of neighbors filled the air. The final mic drop wasn't a grand gesture, but a quiet, shared moment of victory, a reminder that justice, when pursued with determination and unity, always finds a way to prevail. The chapter of HOA tyranny had closed, leaving behind a legacy of resilience and a community reborn. And as Ethan sipped his coffee, watching the world go by with calm satisfaction, he knew that the true measure of success was not in the battles fought, but in the peaceful life reclaimed, a life defined not by rules imposed from above, but by the collective strength of neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder. Fade to black,